Welcome to Israel, the most prophetic land and nation on earth. In this exciting episode of the Prophetic Connection, we're going to discover how this holy land and the people who live here are integral to God's plans and purposes for the nations. This place, the Mount of Olives. Fulfilling the prophecy, waiting for the day when the In this new series of the Prophetic Connection, we've been discovering how God chose one nation, living in one place, to connect heaven with earth. Consider God's promises to Abraham, the first patriarch of Israel. It's found in Genesis 17, beginning in verse 7. "And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. Also I give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." In this episode, we want to discover why the land and the people of Israel are inseparable in the plans and purposes of Almighty God.
The Holy Land, with its rolling hills, treacherous desert, and ancient ruins, its lush gardens and fertile fields. A land with a remarkable and deeply meaningful past, present, and future. It is here that the people and events contained in the Bible truly come to life. This is where it happened. It's where biblical history began, and it's where history itself will dramatically conclude. But just how important is this land in Israel's story, in Israel's journey, as the nation God chose to connect heaven to earth? To find out, we must go back in time to visit Israel's founding father, Abraham, and explore the covenants God made with him.
The first thing that God did in speaking to Abraham was say, pick yourself up, leave your where you were born, across the somewhere in Mesopotamia, and go take this trek and go to the promised land.
So this whole idea of the covenant, it's like, again, a contractual agreement. Abraham says to God, the chosen people idea is, I choose you. I dedicate my life and the life of my family to having relationship with you and teaching the world about the reality of you and the values that come from that relationship. And God says back to Abraham, I choose you back. Okay, I give you, I hand you the baton, so to speak. It's your job. And he says, we have a deal now. You keep your side of the bargain, I keep mine. My side of the bargain is, if you do what you're supposed to do, I'll give you a piece of real estate to do it in, which is the land of Israel. And I promise you that you'll always have that land and that your descendants will always survive and that ultimately you will be successful.
From the very beginning, God promised the land of Israel to Abraham and his descendants. God's plan was that from this land, the children of Israel would teach the world about himself and to elevate the world back to the state it was in the Garden of Eden. Abraham eventually settled in the Promised Land, what was then called the land of Canaan. It was here that Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac was born. It was here that Jacob, whose name would later be turned to Israel, was also born. Yet because of severe famine, Jacob and his family were driven from the Promised Land to Egypt, where they were ultimately enslaved for over 400 years. All the while, the goal of the children of Israel, especially under the leadership of Moses, remained the same: to get back to the land God promised their forefathers.
Too few people understand that Judaism is not just an ism like Christianity or Islam or Buddhism are. It's not just a faith community. It's not just a theological philosophy of God and religion and practice. Judaism started as a family, which became a tribe and became a nation, as we discussed earlier, molded by Moses, our teacher, in the desert, and then coming to the land of Israel, where we lived as a sovereign people, as a nation state, for over 1,000 years, with a very short break between the first temple and the second temple of about 70 years, where we didn't have sovereignty in the land. And the concept of a Jewish national identity and peoplehood has been constant throughout the 2,000 years that we were dispersed from our actual nation-state territory, with the dream of returning to that nation-state.
The land of Israel is not just a random piece of real estate. I mean, people often ask, because I'm also a tour guide, why this spot, why Jerusalem? You expect like Mount Everest would be a much more impressive mountain, The point is, what Israel lacks in physical size and what Jerusalem, the Mount Moriah, lacks, it makes up for in spiritual greatness. We say there's an intrinsic energy or connectability between heaven and earth that takes place in Jerusalem. And that for the Jewish people, it's the place where we can best actualize our potential and build that relationship with God. The way I like to explain it is, imagine you have an appliance that has a unique plug. And we know you travel around the world, there's different wall outlets and different currents. You put an appliance with the wrong, if it doesn't run on the right current, like you got a 220 appliance and a 120 outlet, it's just not gonna run well. It's probably gonna be damaged. It probably will damage the appliance. So we say the Jewish people are a very unique appliance. We have a plug that only plugs into one outlet, which is the land of Israel. And that ultimately the only place the Jewish people can maximize their potential and run at full output will be the land of Israel. And since the Jewish people are a nation and a religion, we're supposed to have a national homeland. And since our connection to the land of Israel is first and foremost a spiritual connection, so the place to do that, obviously, is the spiritual power supply, which is specifically, in general, the land of Israel, and specifically Jerusalem itself, which is the ultimate, I would say, the motherboard of the Jewish people. So basically, it's the piece of real estate that enables the Jewish people collectively to actualize their potential and build this nation that's supposed to be a light to nations.
It is clear that the Jews have a very strong connection to the Promised Land. Yet of all the cities of the Promised Land, there is one that is most important to both the Jewish people and to God: the city of Jerusalem. For within Jerusalem lies the most sacred place of all, Mount Zion. The Jewish Bible, which Christians call the Old Testament, mentions Jerusalem or Zion an astounding 823 times. It is the only city on earth where God explicitly says He has placed His name. This city is even inscribed on God's palms according to Isaiah 49 verse 16. It is here that King David worshipped in the tabernacle. It is here that the temple of Yahweh was built, destroyed, and built again. And it is ultimately from this city that the Messiah, for Christians, Jesus, will one day come and establish a reign that will illuminate the entire world. Yet to many in our world, this very sacred territory does not belong to Israel or the Jewish people. And to some, it is no longer important to God. Instead, this land is called Palestine, and its rightful heirs are the Palestinians. The question is, how did God's holy land come to be called Palestine in the first place?
The Roman Empire renamed the land of Israel Palestine after the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135. Their purpose was to disconnect the Jewish people from their land by not only exiling them, but actually changing the name of the region. And they named Judea, they renamed Judea Palestine. It's interesting that they did this not when they destroyed the temple in the year 70. In fact, they issued a special coin then, which on the coin you can see the words Judea Capta. So they were still using the word Judea. When the Jewish nation rebelled, though, 60 years later, they said, okay, that's enough, we're changing the name to Palestine. And they thought that would be the end of the Jewish people. What happened was that Jews went through history being called Palestinians. And in fact, if you look at English translations of the Talmud, you have the Babylonian Talmud and you have the Palestinian Talmud. The one that was written in Israel is called the Palestinian Talmud. And when Mark Twain writes about the Palestinians who he who he met here. He's talking about the Jews who he met here in Iraq, about the Palestinians who have been exiled. And then in the century before the State of Israel was created, Jews continued to be identified with Palestinians. In fact, the Zionist Jews were the ones who were called Palestinians. And in fact, when they talked about a Palestinian state, or a state of Palestine, they were referring to a Jewish state.
That was certainly not the end of the Jewish people, nor was it the end of a strong Jewish connection to the Promised Land. Throughout nearly 2,000 years of dispersion, Jerusalem remained in the prayers and longings of Jewish people everywhere. And God remained faithful to the covenant he had made with Abraham and his descendants. In recent times, the Jewish people have returned to the land God promised them. In 1948, a miracle of biblical proportions occurred. The Jewish nation of Israel was born once again in the land God had promised to Abraham 4,000 years before. It is clear that the Jewish people continue to be important to God. And it's also clear that the land of Israel is still a vital part of God's prophetic plans and purposes.
The clear message of the Bible and of the Hebrew prophets that are reflected in the Bible is that the land and the people of Israel are inseparable. When the people of Israel were dispersed from the land for nearly 2,000 years, the land was in mourning. But the people themselves, when they were in their dispersion, they were in mourning. Only when the two come together is there harmony in the creation. They were designed by God to be inseparable entities, the people and the land. As far back as God's call upon the life of Abraham, we read this in Genesis chapter 12, where God said to Abraham, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you." Abraham hadn't seen the land, but God was going to take him there and show him the land. "And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Abraham had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, but the covenant line was through Isaac. They would be the nation that God said would come from Abraham's loins. And Isaac then through Jacob. And so when we get to Genesis chapter 35, we read this wonderful confirmation of God's plan for Israel and the land. Verse 9 of Genesis 35. "Then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram, and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. Your name shall not be called Jacob anymore, but Israel shall be your name." Israel means prince with God. So he called his name Israel. Also God said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body." So this is following the logic from God's promises to Abraham and the covenant that he made with him. Verse 12, "The land which I gave Abraham and Isaac," meaning your father and your grandfather, "I give to you, and to your descendants after you I give this land." Then God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. So Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with him, a pillar of stone, and poured a drink offering on it, and poured oil on it. And Jacob called the name of the place where God spoke with him Beth-el. And so we continue down through the generations, because from Jacob came 12 sons. And the 12 sons then became the 12 tribes of Israel. But then the descendants go into captivity in the land of Egypt. And they're there for approximately 400 years. But even then, God had a plan. And what does time mean to God? One day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like one day. the Apostle Peter wrote in the New Testament. So now we see that God has called Abraham, confirmed his promise to his son Isaac and to his son Jacob. Now, some 400 years later, God chooses another man, and that man's name was Moses. Exodus 3, beginning verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. And then, of course, God speaks to him and tells him that he's standing on holy ground. He should remove his shoes, because where the presence of the Lord is, there is holiness. And then, verse 7 of Exodus 3, and the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. They were being oppressed by their Egyptian overlords, but God saw it. Why he didn't stop it earlier, only God knows. But he had a plan of intervention, and that would come through a leader, a deliverer called Moses. So God sees his people in Egypt, and he says, I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. Sometimes, you know, we go through suffering and we wonder why God allows it. And there's no easy explanation to those hard questions of life. Here we see Israel suffering. God sees it. He feels their pain. But in his own time, he chooses to deliver them. And here's what it says in verse 8 of Exodus chapter 3. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And then God describes the tribes that are living in that land that Israel will have to displace in order to take its inheritance, the inheritance in the land God promised to Abraham way back when. This land and this people called Israel are inseparable in the plan of God. Now, we follow down through history and we get to the year 135 AD in the Christian era. And in that year, the name of the land of Israel was changed to Palestine. This was by the Emperor Hadrian, the Roman emperor. And this was in response to a Jewish popular revolt uprising. But Hadrian was determined not just to put down the rebellion, but to wipe out every vestige of linkage between the people called Israel, the Jewish people, and the land called Israel. So he deliberately caused a dispersion, but more than that, as if to insult the Jewish people, he took away the name Israel from the land and gave it the name Palestine, which was a derivative of a word in the Old Testament meaning the Philistines, the enemies of Israel, the coastal peoples who were Gentiles, not Jews, but Hadrian wanting to insult the Israelites, but more than that, wanting to wipe out from memory any history of Israel, and the people of Israel changed the name of the land to Palestine. And that name remained all the way down through the centuries for about 1800 years. And it remained and was known. And even under the British Mandate, at the beginning of partway through the 20th century, the British Mandate was a mandate for Palestine. But God had made promises through the Hebrew prophets that the people of Israel would be reconnected with their land. And in a sense, heaven then would be reconnected with earth through them, because it always had to be a connection that occurred in the land itself. So Israel was back in the land in 1948, according to the promises of God, and after the horrendous suffering of the Holocaust in the Second World War. And David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of modern Israel, in a land called Palestine, brings out a new constitution for the new nation, which was really an old nation, reborn. And he said the name of this new nation will be Israel. And that was its proper name all the way down through history, except for that interlude because of the Emperor Hadrian. It was always Israel, and it is Israel again today. Now, there is conflict in the land over the land. And Israel today is made up of many different peoples. But listen to the word of the psalmist in Psalm 122, when he says, I was glad when they said to me, let us go up to the house of the Lord. Our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem is built as a city that is compact together, where the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, to the testimony, meaning the Ark of the Covenant of Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord, for thrones are set there for judgment, the thrones of the house of David. Then this appeal to all of us who read these words. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you. Peace be within your walls, prosperity within your palaces. For the sake of my brethren and companions, I will now say, peace be within you, because the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your good. But what about the other peoples in the land of Israel that are not Jewish, who have come here one way or another, or down through history have lived here, the descendants, the Arab descendants of former families that have always lived in the land of Israel, but who were not part of the covenant that came through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? What of them? They matter to God as well. And we read in the book of Leviticus, in chapter 19, we read these words concerning other people. In verse 33, and if a stranger dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat him. The stranger who dwells among you shall be to you as one born among you. And you shall love him as yourself. There's no higher form of love than loving him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So here God says, through Moses, to the children of Israel, down through the centuries, and these words have application today in the 21st century. Treat those who are strangers in your midst as though they were yourself. So when we speak about rights, then we need to identify the rights of all the people that live in the land of Israel. And they should be treated as, because Israel was a stranger in a strange land, in the land of Egypt. But the land and the people of Israel are inseparable in the plan of God, and they are and always were his linkage between heaven and earth. Behind me, the glorious city of Jerusalem, basking in the afternoon sunlight. City of God, city of the great King. The only place on earth God said he would place his name, and that is where that golden dome is in the background. There's an irony in the name of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem means city of peace. But this city over my shoulders has known nothing but strife down through its history. Even today, when things seem tranquil, there are riots on the Temple Mount in the very holy place of God as people battle over the prize that is Jerusalem. The prophets have told us that a day is coming when the nations are going to battle over Jerusalem. And these hills that you see around me, they will be covered with the armies of the nations coming once again, as empires have done throughout history, and clashing here at the holy place. But peace is promised in the Bible, and it will come when the Prince of Peace comes and he descends onto the Mount of Olives over my shoulder, my left shoulder, the tall tower that you can see in the distance. When he comes, he will rule and reign from Jerusalem, and at last the peoples of the earth will have peace, because he will establish that peace.